So, if you've been on the channel a while, you'll know that as well as a 40K fan, I enjoy one-page rules Grimdark Future. Recently, they had a story writing competition, but with a twist. Entries were limited to 1,000 words, aka one page, had to be set in their grimdark future or fantasy setting and conform to a set theme. The theme this time was Unlikely Allies. I picked 5 sci-fi stories from the top 20 and numbered them 1 to 5. Take a listen and let me know in the comments which story is your top pick. So long, until our next adventure.
The Hunt, by the Warp Storm Chronicler. Elowin scanned the dense jungle planet of Orvan II and realized there was nowhere safe to land. He struggled with the controls of his shuttle as the engines completely shut down and he started to fall like a rock. It was not going to be the soft landing he had hoped for. Grog smiled to himself and rubbed his big green hands together in glee. The prints he had found were fresh, so the great beast couldn't be far away. Suddenly his attention was drawn to the falling ship that screeched through the night sky above him to crash down nearby. It impacted with a loud boom that panicked the colorful winged lizards in the trees, which flew away in all directions. Grog grunted and went to investigate. The crashed shuttle wasn't hard to find. It had half buried itself in a crater at the end of the long track it had cleaved through the thick jungle. The vessel was a shard of white-colored metal with a small cockpit that had a solitary empty chair inside. Of the pilot, there was no sign. Grog called out, but there was no reply. That's when he saw one of the large grabber plants just beyond the tree line. The carnivorous plant's 6-foot-tall pitcher-shaped body was engorged and swollen. Using the tip of his spear, he made an incision just below where the plant's prey would be slowly digesting, and out gushed an elf with a torrent of sticky, bad-smelling digestive juices. Elowin felt dizzy and confused. Groggily, he pulled himself up onto his knees and wiped the sticky white fluid from his stinging eyes to see a spear-wielding orc brute towering over him. Startled, Elowin leapt up and tried to run, but he slipped in the puddle of digestive juices he had knelt in and fell onto his back. "Easy now," Grog said. "It's clear that this hasn't been your day. Take a breath." Elowin rose unsteadily to his feet. He looked back at the plant that had tried to eat him, and then at his unlikely savior, piecing together what had happened. "Thank you," Elowin said. "Thank you for saving my life. What are one of you doing way out here? I was on a mission to establish diplomatic relations, but the shuttle crashed." "I see that." Grog nodded, looking back as the shuttle erupted into flames. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but the jungle is no place for a leaf ear. Best you call your kind for a pickup and go home. I have an emergency beacon, but it needs to be used at a higher altitude. Perhaps you could come with me?" Elowin asked. Grog shook his head. "Sorry, I'm on the hunt for the great beast. It's my final test to become chieftain. Perhaps I can help you with the beast, and then you can help me?" Grog eyed the skinny elf in front of him and scoffed. "You don't strike me as much of a warrior. I'm more useful in a fight than I look," Elowin said. "That I'd like to see." Grog chuckled and went back to tracking the great beast with the filth-covered elf scampering after him. Despite his gruff and intimidating appearance, Grog turned out to be surprisingly jovial company, and Elowin found himself enjoying his witty banter as they made their way through the jungle. He had never expected orcs to be funny. For his part, Grog was happy to have someone to talk to. The trial of the last hunt was a task for a lone orc aspirant, and he had been tracking the rare great beast by himself for weeks. As far as he was aware, there was nothing in the rules that said non-orcs couldn't be involved. Not that he expected any assistance from the weedy elf. Eventually, they came upon the great beast, a large insectoid thing sleeping on a rocky outcrop in the middle of a small clearing. Grog signaled for Elowin to be quiet. "I like you, Leafear. Stay here and you won't die. This will be over soon," he told him and entered the clearing. Just as he reached striking distance, the great beast jolted awake and pounced at him. Grog deflected it with the heft of his spear, and then the two were locked in a chaotic dance of thrusting attacks, slashing claws and desperate dodges. Despite his martial skill, Grog was slowly being forced back. He brought up his spear to block a powerful downward strike, and it cut his weapon in half. The creature's monstrous maw lunged forward to take a bite out of the exposed grog when Elowin barreled into him, knocking the orc aside. A jaw full of sharp teeth clamped down on Elowin's shoulder, and he cried out in agony. Grog recovered, and using the distraction, brought the steel point of his broken spear down onto the great beast's head with both hands. He drove it down until it released Elowin and slumped to the ground, dead. Grog rushed to Elowin's side and examined his wound. "The warrior spirits favor you, Leafear. You'll be just fine and with a good scar to go with the story," Grog told him as he helped him to his feet. "A scar? That sounds just great. Do you think I can get a little help with this now?" Elowin sighed as he took the transmitter from his pocket. "Sure thing, my friend. And you were right," Grog grinned. "I guess you aren't as useless as you look." "And you're not as brutish as you sound," Elowin laughed. Elowin entered the debriefing room aboard the High Elf capital ship and took a seat. "How did the hunt for allies go?" the commander asked. "The engineered encounter with the new chieftain proceeded exactly as you planned. I established a good connection, and we now have a powerful friend on Orvan too." Liberate by L.E. Amaranth. I didn't expect an angel to look like that. Just over a meter tall, the creature was the size of a child. Yet she stood with the confidence of an avenging saint, hands clasped tight around a rifle nearly as long as she was tall. The light from a fire out in the corridor silhouetted her, bathing a dark cloak in an amber hue. She approached, steps quieter than death on the cold metal floor. My tormentor had fallen to his knees, his gauntlet still clamped around my meager tunic. He had forgone the push-button ease of the pain-giver collar and had prepared to deliver one of his lessons with his armored fist before the gunshot had torn through his chest. His breathing now was heavy, ragged. Flecks of blood speckled the front of his armored carapace. Hunched over like this, his sapphire armor made him appear like an enormous wounded beetle, an object of pity, not fear. But though the first shot had brought him low, it had not finished him. Battle brothers died hard, or not at all. "Who dares wound a brother of the Azure Blade?" he wheezed, rising to an enormous superhuman height. If he towered over me, he surely dwarfed the diminutive being. But she did not seem to fear for her life. In fact, her snouted mouth pulled back into a mocking sneer. "You bleed, you not gods. Fear not you," she said, the words clipped and blunt but clearly in the standard tongue. The master laughed, his pain forgotten as he revelled in the apparent absurdity. He dropped me to the floor, hand going to the blade at his side. He unsheathed it, its metal surface flashing with pale blue light. I could see the face of my angel now. She was a rat, a relatively enormous humanoid rat, but a rat nonetheless. Her right eye was cybernetic, with a wide lens that looked grafted from a surveillance camera. Her left was her own, currently locked onto the shaking armored hulk that had almost ended my life. Implants and scars pocked what parts of her body were visible. I thought about cursing whatever gods there were for sending me such a mocking deliverance. But I stopped. Who was I to wish for a more palatable savior? I had been press-ganged by the Azure Blade during a protective raid on my homeworld when I was old enough to lift a crate. They were warriors foremost, and so they used others to do all the menial work. The lifting, the cooking, the endless cleaning. The brothers used an unfamiliar calendar, but to my reckoning, I had been on the ship for over 5 years. 5 long, arduous years of menial labor, of mocking laughter, and of occasional bouts of profound cruelty. And just before he was about to take out his frustration with another wretched display, alarms had gone off. The ship had been boarded by parties unknown. And here she was. Master was an expert with the energy sword. He'd been very keen to show how quick it would make me go away if I was late with his meals. Kidding, of course. He'd laughed. I hadn't. He swept out with martial confidence, uttering something about pest control. But the rat being was a small target, and preternaturally quick on her feet. The chest wound she had left him with had not made things easier, and his once whip-like reflexes slowed to drunken staggering. A dawning realization. She wasn't fighting with him, she was tiring him out, making him exert himself, making his hearts beat faster, pump more blood out of his open wound. "Die, rat filth!" he screamed, clutching at his chest with his offhand, a hum from her enormous rifle. To me, it sounded like the noise the reheater made when a fresh meal was ready to be served. Ding! Perhaps a moment of clarity reached the master as well. He threw himself at her, hoping to deflect the weapon's aim. She simply put the muzzle between him and her while falling supine. With the weapon stabilized by her prehensile tail, she fired point-blank into his chest. A solid bolt of night tore through his armor, carving a second, deeper hole that no medic could fix. He collapsed, gasping and sputtering, his vital essence draining into the expensive carpet that he'd been so insistent I keep spotless. "You're nothing, but a—" The last contemptuous words died on his lips. Were the words meant for her, or me? We would never know. And then, save for the crackling of the fire outside, there was silence. I lay there frozen, unsure if the creature would even deign to notice me. Perhaps it would have been kind and end me quick and without pain. I made myself look as small and pathetic as possible, but she approached nevertheless. She did not threaten me, nor did she move to strike me down. Instead, she held out her hand, or paw. "Come, fire soon. Not safe." I looked between her and the body of my master, still unable to register the new reality. With trepidation, I let her help me to my feet. She looked me over once, poked at my tunic to make sure the blood on the cloth was not mine, then nodded once. Come. Pod close by. My clan strip this ship, then leave. We go to Warren Rock. Safety there." She scuttled to the door and swept both directions of the corridor for threats. Acrid smoke clawed up the doorframe and clung to the ceiling above. I couldn't move. My mind was racing. In lieu of 1,000 other questions, I asked the only one that came to mind. "Why? Why save me?" She turned and pointed to the collar around my neck. Then she pulled back her cloak to reveal an implant lodged against her windpipe. The design was crude, but it was almost certainly similar to the one that had inflicted excruciating pain upon me at the push of a button. "No cages," the creature said, her lone eye narrowing with resolve. "For no one. Ever again." Pals, by Spaz Frag. Gribble admired his new eye. He had pulled it out of one of the metal fella's skulls. It was still blinky, warm, and every so often it would zap his eye socket, and his brain would feel all fuzzy. He tightened his goggles to make sure his new prize stayed in place, and leaned into the hatch of the small tank he shared with Ratchet. "Oi, Ratchet, what do you think of me new eye?" Below, in the cramped cockpit, Ratchet absent-mindedly replied, "Blinky, blinky." As he tied 2 wires together, sparks flying. Good old Ratchet always knew what to say. What a pal. Gribble strapped himself into the small turret on top of the tank. It ground unenthusiastically as he gave it a quick test swivel. Focusing his new blinky eye on the scrap-filled battlefield before them, he cried, "Kick it, Ratchet!" Below, jamming too many levers forward and working more pedals than he had feet, Ratchet called back, "Kicking her!" As the tank ground through the wreckage, Gribble had to admit he was wrong. When the boss deorbited that asteroid onto the battlefield to wipe out the metal fellas, he had thought it was a bad idea. Turns out the boss was right. Not a single robo survived the impact. Sure, he and Ratchet hadn't seen any of the other green boys since they had dug themselves out of the rubble afterward. But winning was winning. That's why you never argue with the boss. Gibble scanned the debris around them as he listlessly swiveled the cupola in circles. His blinky green eye left a small dot resting wherever he looked. "Oi, Ratchet! It's a laser eye! Look at it!" "Zippy zap," mumbled Ratchet, puffing on a twist of smouldering wires. He eyed a robo-man pinned limply against a crumbling wall. "Kneel before Gribble, the greeny eye!" he yelled, and unleashed a small caliber torrent at the figure. The impacts pockmarked the wall, the robot, not so much. He heard a snickering from below. He gritted his teeth. "I meant to do that, Ratchet. I'm the gunner. If I wanted him dead, he'd be kilt dead." As they bickered, the debris around the figure began to move, and a swarm of small, bug-like bots burst outward, attacking the robot's body, rapidly disassembling it. Gribble stared slack-jawed. The bots, having finished, turned to stare their tiny green mono-eyes at Gribble. Are you fellas? Just passing through." As he spoke, he reached his boot down to nudge Ratchet's shoulder. "Get us out of here, Ratchet," he whispered out of the corner of his mouth. Room," Ratchet exclaimed quietly, the tank whirling slowly and pulling away. The small bug bots began to follow, forming a line single file behind the tank. "Ratchet! They following us like ducks, little glowy-eyed ducks." "Quack, quack," said Ratchet, kicking at a small fire flaring up under his control box. The tank rolled onward, and the small bots grew in number, wriggling free of the scrap heaps around them as they passed. Gibble began to panic. "Git!" he yelled, drawing his pistol. "We ain't done nothing to you. Get out of here." He began firing wildly at the line of machines, his shots going wide, hitting the nearby wreck of a truck. The small bots looked at him, then at the smoking holes in the truck. They rushed to swarm it. Pulling apart its mass in moments, they carried the parts back to the small goblin tank. Climbing it, they began affixing the truck parts. Small flames shot from them, welding the pieces in place. When they were done, the bots fell back in line, staring at Gribble. Once again, slack-jawed, Gribble stared at the swarm. "Oi, Ratchet! They might think I'm their mommy. Ratchet!" Below Ratchet sat hands up as a small bot rewired the terminal in front of him. When it finished, he cautiously grabbed the new controls and punched them forward. The tank kicked up dust as the addition of 2 wheels and an extra engine catapulted it into action. As they drove, Gribble kept marking wrecks they passed, the bots pouncing on whatever he turned his new eye on. The tank kept growing, and so did the swarm. They drove until they found themselves at the edge of a large crater. Ratchet surveyed the scene. This was where the bosses were fighting the biggest, baddest of the Abot men. There had to be some good stuff here. Twisted metal was piled high, most of it no more than fused slag. A tall structure stuck at an odd angle from the mass of debris. Gribble started to point to it, but before he could send the swarm, the ground began to shake. It rose from the wreckage on giant metal spider legs, towering high above the tank. An insect-like head swiveled to look down at them, followed by a small army's worth of gun barrels. "Drive, Ratchet, drive!" Gribble screamed, unloading all his firepower on the massive thing. Green Eye focused in on the massive legs as Ratchet swerved between them. The small bots swarmed up the behemoth. Metal began to rain around them, smashing against the tank as the massive joints were disassembled. Battered, Ratchet tried to get clear as the massive machine fell. They crashed to a stop, the collapsing spider walker covering them in dust and debris. Ratchet clambered out of the smoking tank's cockpit to flop beside Gribble. A single tear leaked from under his goggles as he looked at his beloved, now bedraggled machine. "It ain't so bad, Ratchet," Gribble said, slapping the tank's tread. "We can fix her." At that moment, the tread, with a crunch, fell inward onto the remains of the cockpit. Gribble winced, Ratchet sniffled. Slowly, the small bots began gathering around them, large parts of the spider walker in tow. The goblins smiled. Gribble punched his arm. "See, Ratchet, our little pals already have some ideas." "Quack, quack," said Ratchet with hope. Saved Above a Burning World, by Marissa. The battle went achingly poorly, despite Destroyer Captain Arago's considerable efforts. One by one, the vulnerable refugee ships were being picked off. Inside the capital ship of his strike force, Arago bent his powerful mental abilities to surveying the void conflict. Screams of the dying wailed out like nails on a chalkboard directly inside his mind. A single tear welled out, trailing down his cheek as he looked out on the flashes of light. Under any other circumstances, the display would have been mesmerizing. However, the hypnotic beauty was utterly dispelled by the weight of each flash. Every one of them could puncture a vessel clean through, venting its occupants to the cold void of space. Eyes scanning his own struggling fleet, Arago sought weak spots. While his men arrayed themselves well to protect the delicate refugee vessels that swam up from the burning world below, the enemy simply held too much firepower for them to protect them completely. Even as he watched, Arago spotted a ship slip out of formation under the strain, and his eyes widened in horror. Without the correct alignment, the ship wouldn't be able to draw on the other shields in the formation if focused on. Before Arago could bark out instructions to protect the misaligned vessel, the guns of the enemy swiveled to target, smelling weakness. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the ship's singular shield failed, and the structure was riddled with holes. From his view, he could see how it had been a perfect execution of firepower, without any wasted energy on overkill. Sparing a moment to touch the mark of the founder he carried as a necklace, Arago swallowed the pain and regret that threatened to overwhelm him. Outside, the battle raged on. Looking around, he took in the losses his men were suffering. While the refugee ships were being targeted first, this world had angered Lord Overseer of the Collective into a blind rage. His own ships were being destroyed systematically. As they placed themselves to threaten the key aspects of the Legion's formation, the mighty gun emplacements removed them. Unfortunately, these were losses he could not sustain. Each of the ships he lost were damn near irreplaceable, but it was the men he commanded that were the true prize. Honed into a lethal cross-discipline task force, they contained strategic minds the Empire simply could not afford to lose. Opening his mouth, Arago prepared to issue the withdrawal. The words he knew sentenced 7 million men, women, and children to death. The void above their mining colony would be their graveyard, much like the mass water graves left by battles in the Age of Sail, upon beloved Earth in ages past. A mass of power shredding open reality cut into the captain's mind, forestalling the retreat with a bolt of pain that drove him to his knees. Cries from his scanner operators rang into the bridge, over the klaxon calls of sirens and reverberations of energy weapons discharging. "Sir, Havoc Brother vessels have just jumped into the system." Just when the battle could not have been going any worse, a new enemy arrived. "They're moving into attack formations above the robot fleet, sir." Even the usually unreadable Master Archivist Petrus had allowed shock and confusion to colour his tone. Pausing for only a moment, Arago made a decision. "We must use this chance, move into a covering position for the rest of the refugees." His command was cut across by the communication officer. "Apologies, sir, but we are being hailed." Ignoring the breach of protocol, Arago nodded. On the central console, an array of iron shavings arranged themselves to form the visage of a familiar form. "Destroyer Captain Arago, I see your usual incompetence has led to another unfortunate situation." Even without the usual psychedelic colors of Beres's armor to distract and heighten Arago's emotions, he felt an old rage build. "You would dare show yourself on my battlefield?" The laugh was sickening. "It doesn't much seem to be your battlefield. Appearances seem to indicate it belongs to this enraged collection of metals." Beres continued to speak, cutting over the attempted insertions of Arago. "You don't have long enough to bandy words with me, despite how I enjoy your attempts. I have, much as I am loathed to admit, a proposition for you." Silence reigned for a few seconds, while Arago glared into Beres's face. Finally, biting off each word, he spoke. "I'm listening." A grin stretched over Beres's scarred face, pulling too wide and showing far too many teeth. "This particular Legion store a mineral needed for use in some of our, shall we say, more invigorating compounds. If you do not fire upon my fleet whilst we board and take it, I shall distract the enemy for you to take those pitiful wretches someplace away from eradication." "Why bother even speaking to me? This isn't even a conversation. You know I planned on doing that anyway." "Oh, brother, I miss our old chats sometimes, and this seemed like far too good an opportunity to watch your blood pressure get the better of you." The connection cut as the iron flakes dropped back into the large bowl. "Founder preserve me," Arago muttered, before closing his eyes and focusing on his breathing. When the red eyes opened, they did so with a singular purpose. "Relay orders to the fleet. The Havoc Brothers vessels are not to be targeted unless fired upon." Arago watched as the Legion ships began to maneuver to face the new threat and swivel gun emplacements. "Make all haste to escape the gravity well. We will follow the refugees through, return to base and regroup." Looking up, as the first array of Havoc boarding nails fired towards the Legion vessels, Arago again touched the symbol of the founder. He could almost feel the eyes of Beres as his old friend looked down. His heart pumped in rage and sorrow as he refocused once again. Class Warfare by Neravin. The day cycle on Kalish was 34 hours. For the elves stationed in the crumbling remnants of its capital city, battered and bloodied by ceaseless shardfire, it seemed nearly twice that. For nearly a month, the shining light of the High Fleets had worked to uproot their darker brethren, and High Seer Filrin was beginning to get annoyed. Children of the Bloody Petal, what a stupid name. He massaged his temples with one hand, the other tapping out an unhurried rhythm on the arm of his chair. Do we know why they have called for a ceasefire? Presumably for terms, Seer. Galrath, an Avenger with an excellent bloodline and skills to match, handed him a tablet. Lists of unit placements, supplies, and standing orders scrolled by as Filrin examined it. At the bottom was an estimated count of dead children. Gang territory or no, they cannot hold out much longer with the losses they have sustained. Filrin frowned down at the lists. Their own forces had suffered here. Many an esteemed family had lost sons and daughters, and while many of them were surely spares or standover heirs, the casualty list was untenable. If it were not for the prize, they stood to win. The thought of it was enough to wipe the frown away, even enough to bring a slight smile to the old elf's face. A core of the Avatar of Flames. Such a thing would be an immense boon to the fleet's defences. It would also have the lovely effect of securing his position as leader of the Grand Council for another few centuries. But that was entirely secondary. He handed the tablet back to his companion. At least the lower classes passed on some common sense. We've been pounding their central position for nearly a week now. Seer, considering the history of the gangs, I rather think they may have enjoyed the pounding. Filrin could hear the smile beneath Galrath's helm, and his own turned to a sour grimace. Send a messenger. They shall have their ceasefire. 30 minutes later, remarkably quick for dregs, the High Seer mused, enemy leadership arrived at the fleet command post. It came in the form of a pair of ragged and weary elves, one woman and one mutilated beyond recognition. Filrin had to fight the sneer from taking over as he examined the gene technician, unsure where the leather clothes it wore ended and its stitched and scarred skin began. The woman, by comparison, was almost radiant in her bladed, jet-black armor. This is what passes for command. In his gold and silver runed robes, Filrin felt embarrassed on their behalf. He glanced about the room, catching the eye of Galrath and his fellow Avengers lining the room. Shard guns were trained on the dregs en masse. To what do we owe this pleasure? Arvale of the Bloody Petal, and this is Skeln. The woman spoke for both in a nasal accent, as the gene technician's mouth was sewn shut. We have come to discuss terms. Filrin smiled graciously down on them. How far the dialect had wandered. Praise the gods of fate for such sensible action. My aide has a tablet prepared with such terms for your surrender, if you would be so kind as to take a look. Beg pardon, Seer, but that's not what I meant. His title was smothered in her sarcasm, and he could do nothing but blink in astonishment as she continued on, turning to face Galrath. The Bloody Petal will accept your people's surrender and let you all run back to your fleets, provided your Seer stays with us. The Avenger snorted. You can't be serious. We have you pinned. And you will address me, Filrin broke in with a clipped tone, if you expect to make it out of this post alive, let alone the planet. What madness has taken you to make such an absurd offer? Am I to assume you don't accept the terms? It took all his will not to bark out in laughter. No, of course we don't, you pitiful. Arvale shrugged, then turned to her companion. You heard him, Skeln. The gene technician grinned, and things went to hell. Around the room there was a rumbling grind, followed by shouts of surprise as metal spikes burst through the ground. No, not spikes, Filrin thought as they burst up and out from beneath them. Claws. He recognized the threshing blades that had been meant for wheat turned to something far more sinister. The Seer fell back, reaching blindly behind him for his helm. Galrath, he yelled in a panicked fury. They were to have been screened. They were. They didn't have anything on them, From beyond the churning earth where metal, elvenoid torsos were now being peppered with shardfire, both Avenger and Seer saw Skeln reach up and tear its jaw off. It dug into the soft palate of its mouth and pulled from it a blinking beacon. The thing winked at the dumbfounded pair, before being hidden by the monstrous frames of robotic legionnaires as they bore down. The sounds of shardfire began to slow at first, as the walking nightmares waded into the Avengers, then ceased, and then the only sound for a time was of wet slicing and unholy splattering. Arval and Skeln approached the Lord of the Flesh-Eaters as it cleaned its blades. No fleet elf in the room was left in chunks larger than a booted foot. They bowed. Thank you, 589. Your assistance here was invaluable. It turned its mask of a face to them. Statement. Our thanks to you, Bloody Petal. This would not have been possible without your knowledge of the Avatar cause. Query: now that our betrayers are dead, what is the next step? Arvel smiled, a wicked knife in the glow of robotic eyes. Now, with their leader dead, we let them rot for a bit, just like they did to all of us.
I hope you enjoyed the stories. There were a lot of good entries. If I have more time, I might see if I can upload some more. Until then, don't forget to drop the number of your favorite in the comments, and consider saying why you liked it and rating the others as well. Thanks to the other authors for letting me upload their work. If you liked the narration, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our little channel. It's really, really appreciated. Until next time, goodbye from the Warp Storm.